Hello everyone, I am Jenny Rose Uri from BSE 1B, and today we are having a pen and paper video problem solving about accounting cycle, journal entries with chart of accounts. We have here problem 11. Joanne Java Review School entered into the following transactions during October 2020. On October 1, Java made additional investments of 50,000 in the business. I have here ready my financial transaction worksheets. Increased in assets, particularly cash, no effects on liabilities, and increased in equity, particularly Java capital. We put that in our journal entry. We have here October 1. So, we debit cash for 50,000 and we credit Java capital for 50,000. Explanation: investment of owner. Investment of owner. On October 1, 2020, there is an increase in asset, particularly cash. So we debit cash for 50,000, and there is a corresponding increase in equity, particularly Java capital. So we credit Java capital for 50,000. Explanation: investment of owner. So October 2, both liabilities insurance for 1 year 40,500, increase in assets, particularly prepaid insurance, and decrease in assets, particularly cash. Zero effect in liabilities and equities. So we put that in journal entry. October 2, we debit prepaid insurance for 14,500, and we credit cash 14,500. Explanation: both insurance. So on October 2, 2020, there is an increase in asset, particularly prepaid insurance. So we debit prepaid insurance for 14,500. And decrease in asset, particularly cash. So we credit cash for 15,500. Explanation: both insurance. On October 3, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly advertising expense. So we debit advertising expense for 3,200, and there is a corresponding increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So we credit accounts payable for 3,200. Explanation: bill for advertisement. October 4, paid rent for the month for 8,900. So there is a decrease in assets, particularly cash, and decreased in equity, particularly rent expense. No effects on liabilities. So we put that in our journal entry. October 4. We debit rent expense. For 8,900, and we credit cash for 8,900. Explanation: payment for rent. So on October 4, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly rent expense. So we debit rent expense for 8,900, and there is a corresponding October 4, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly rent expense. So we debit rent expense for 8,900, and a corresponding decrease in asset, particularly cash. So we credit cash for 8,900. Explanation: payment for rent. October 7, received a bill for equipment repair from E. Hipolito for 2,880. No effects on assets. Increased in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. Decreased in equity, particularly repair expense. October 7, we debit repair expense for 2,880, and we credit accounts payable for 2,880. Explanation: bill for repair. On October 7, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly repair expense. So we debit repair expense for 2,880, and the corresponding increase in liabilities. Hindi kita. On October 7, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly repair expense. So we debit repair expense for 2,880, and there is a corresponding increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So we credit accounts payable for 2,880. Explanation: bill for repair. On October 10, Received and deposited tuition from students for 62,500. Increased in assets, particularly cash, and increased in income, particularly school fees. So, we put that in our journal entry, October 10. We debit cash for 62,500 and we credit school fees for 62,500. Explanation: received tuition fees. On October 10, 2020, there is an increase in asset, particularly cash. So, we debit cash for 62,500 and there's a corresponding increase in income, particularly school fees. So, we credit school fees for 62,500. Explanation: received tuition fees. October 11, received and paid the telephone bill for 2,300. There is an decrease in asset, particularly cash, and decrease in equity, particularly telecommunications expense. So, October 11. We debit telecommunications expense. Telecommunications expense for 2,300 and we credit cash for 2,300. Explanation: payment for telephone bill. On October 11, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly telecommunications expense. So, we debit telecommunication expense for 2,300 and there is a corresponding decrease in asset, particularly cash. So, we credit cash for 2,300. Explanation: payment for telephone bill. October 15, both chairs from Hawaiian Furniture for 18,800, paying 8,800 in cash and the balance on account. So, there is an increase in asset, particularly furniture, and decreased in another asset, particularly cash, and increased in liability, particularly accounts payable. So, October 15, we debit furniture for 18,800 and we credit cash for 8,800, and another credit accounts payable for 10,000. Explanation, both furniture. So, on October 15, 2020, there is an increase in asset, particularly furniture. So, we debit furniture for 18,800, and there is a corresponding decrease in cash. So, we credit cash for 8,800, and another increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So, we credit accounts payable for 10,000. Explanation, both furniture. Next, October 18. Paid accounts to South Main News for 3,200. So, decreased in asset, particularly cash, and decreased in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So, page 2. October 18. So, we debit accounts payable, payable for 3,200, and we credit, lampas. Wait lang, burahin natin. 0. And we credit cash for 3,200. Explanation, payment for South Main News. South Main News. So, October. On October 18, 2020, there is an increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So, we debit accounts payable to 3,000. On October 18, 2020, there is an increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So, we debit accounts payable for 3,200, and there is a corresponding decrease in assets, particularly cash. So, we credit cash for 3,200. Explanation, payment for South Main News. Next is October 21. Java withdrew 8,000 for personal use. October. So, there is a decrease in asset, particularly cash, and decrease in equity, particularly Java withdrawal. So, October 21. We debit Java withdrawals for 8,000, and we credit cash for 8,000. Explanation, Withdrawals of owner. On October 21, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly JABA withdrawals. So we debit JABA withdrawal for 8,000, and there is a corresponding decrease in asset, particularly cash. So we credit cash for 8,000. Explanation: withdrawals of owner. Next is October 24. Receive a bill for gas and oil from Mindanao Oil Corp for 1,800. So there is an increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable, and decrease in equity, particularly gas and oil expense. 24. We debit gas and oil expense for 1,800, and we credit accounts payable for 1,800. Explanation: receive bill for gas and oil. Gas and oil. Hashtag. On October 24, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly gas and oil expense. So we debit gas and oil expense for 1,800, and there is a corresponding increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So we credit accounts payable for 1,800. Explanation: receive bill for gas and oil. Next is October 25. Receive and deposited tuition from students for 61,400. So there is an increase in assets, particularly cash, and an increase in income, particularly school fees. There is an increase in assets, particularly cash, and increase in income, particularly school fees. So 25. We debit cash for 61,400, and we credit school fees for 61,400. Explanation: receive tuition. On October 25, 2020, there is an increase in assets, particularly cash. So we debit cash for 61,400, and there is a corresponding increase in income, particularly school fees. So we credit school fees for 61,400. Explanation: receive tuition. October 27, paid salaries of the office assistants for 12,000. There is a decrease in assets, particularly cash, and decreased in equity, particularly salaries expense. October 27, we debit salaries expense for 12,000, and we credit cash for 12,000. Explanation: payment for salaries.
Payment for salaries. So on
October 27, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly salaries expense. So we debit salaries expense.
So we debit salaries
expense for 12,000, and there is a corresponding
and
decrease
in
in assets, particularly cash. So we credit cash for
So we credit cash for
12,000.
Explanation:
payment for salaries. Next, October 28, both a photocopier on account from the Diangas office machines for 7,500. There is an increase in asset, particularly equipment, and an increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable.
So we debit
October 28,
equipment
we debit equipment for 7,500, and we credit accounts payable for 7,500. Explanation: both photocopier. On October 28, 2020, there is an increase in asset, particularly equipment. So we debit equipment for 7,500, and there is a corresponding increase in liabilities, particularly accounts payable. So we credit accounts payable for 7,500. Explanation: both copier. Next, October 29, received 7,000 tuitions from a student who had charged the tuition on account last month. So there is an increase in assets, particularly accounts receivable, and an increase in income, particularly school fees. October 29, we debit accounts receivable for 7,000. Mali po ang aking nasulatan. And credit school fees for 7,000. Explanation: receive tuition fees. On October 29, 2020, there is an increase in assets, particularly accounts receivable. So we debit accounts receivable for 7,000, and there is a corresponding increase in income, particularly school fees. So, we credit school fees for 7,000. Explanation, receive tuition fees. Next, October 30, receive and paid the water utilities bill for 3,600. October 30. There is a decrease in assets, particularly cash, and decrease in equity, particularly utilities expense. There is a decrease in assets, particularly cash, and decrease in equity, particularly utilities expense. So, October 30, we debit utilities expense. This expense for 3,600, and we credit cash for 3,600. Explanation, payment for utilities. Utilities. On October 30, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly utilities expense. So we credit utilities expense for 3,600, and there is a corresponding decrease in assets, particularly cash. So we credit cash for 3,600. Explanation, payment for utilities. October 31, paid for flower arrangements for front office for 620. So there is a decrease in assets, particularly cash, and decrease in equity, particularly miscellaneous expense. 31. We debit miscellaneous expense for 620, and we credit cash for 620. Explanation, payment for flower arrangement. Arrangement. On October 31, 2020, there is a decrease in equity, particularly miscellaneous expense. So we debit miscellaneous expense for 620. And there is a corresponding decrease in assets, particularly cash. So we credit cash for 620. Explanation, payment for flower arrangement. Lastly, October 31, Java invested personal computer with a fair market value of 12,300 in the business. So there is an increase in assets, particularly equipment, and increase in equity, particularly Java capital or income. Java capital. So, October 31, 2020, we debit equipment for 12,300, And we credit Java capital for 12,300. Explanation: investment of owner. On October 31, 2020, there is an increase in assets, particularly equipment. So we debit equipment for 12,300, and there is a corresponding increase in income, particularly Java capital. So we credit Java capital for 12,300. Explanation: investment of owner.